Hi, my name's Al, and today I'm going to show you how to replace the bottom bracket on your bike and keep your crank spinning. In order to access the bottom bracket, we're going to have to remove the chain set. So starting with the left hand crank arm here, we need to undo the pinch bolts. You work on one at a time, so just backing each one off gently. You don't want to undo one all the way, because it will put a lot of strain on the remaining bolt and it could damage the threads. Once they're backed off, we can remove the preload cap here. In order to remove this preload cap, we're going to need a special tool. This Part Tool BBT9 has got that tool on the end, or they're available separately. Engage it into the preload cap and undo it, like so. On most Shimano cranks, even with the bolts undone, you won't get the arm off until you flip this tab up here. Just use a little screwdriver, pull that up, and you better remove the crank arm. Should just wiggle off, like so. Okay, before we remove the drive side crank, we're going to need to move anything that's in the way. So on this bike we've got a bit of a chain device that we need to move. So we'll take that off. With that out of the way, we can knock the drive side crank out. In order to remove the drive side crank, you're going to need a soft base mallet such as this, and we're hitting the axle on the non-drive side, knocking it through, and that's that removed. So with the cranks and the rest of the paraphernalia out of the way, we can get on with removing the bottom bracket. The non-drive side, so left hand side of the bike, has a regular thread. So remember, righty tighty, lefty loosey. So we're undoing this in an anti-clockwise fashion. Once it's out, make sure you retain any spacers. They might get stuck to the frame, or they might be on the cup. This frame has got a 73mm bottom bracket shell, so it only runs one spacer, and that's on the drive side. On the drive side, so that's the right hand side of the bike, we have a left hand thread. So we need to be turning this in a clockwise direction to remove it from the frame. This has come out with the spacer, so one spacer, 2.5mm spacer it is, and the central sleeve as well. And that's the whole of the bottom bracket removed. As with anything, once you've got it apart, it's a good idea to give it a good clean before you fit anything new. Also, with a bottom bracket, the main thing that's going to make it run properly is that the bearings are nice and parallel to each other, and the way that you're going to get that is by having the frame nicely faced. So that's a bike shop job. The tool's going to set you back several £100, so it's not really worth investing. But yeah, it's a good idea. Get the bike shop to do that, get the frame prepped nicely before you fit the bottom bracket. If you're sure it's been done, then clean it up, grease it up, and we're ready to fit a new one. Not only do you want to clean the bottom bracket shell, you also want to give the crank a good clean before you refit it. Before we fit the bottom bracket to the nice clean frame, we need to work out where we need to put the spacers and how many we need to use. So out the box, this is the bottom bracket. So we have the drive side and the spacer in between, and then we have the non-drive side over here. 3 spacers come in the box. If you're running a 68, you'll need a 68mm shell on your frame. You'll need 2 spacers on the drive side and 1 on the non-drive side, like so. If you're running a 73, which is 5mm bigger, then you'll need to remove 2 of the spacers, leaving 1 on the drive side, like that. The reason behind this extra spacer is to account for an E-type front mech or a bottom bracket mounted chain device. So if you're running one of those, you'll need to ditch that one as well. Before we fit the new bottom bracket, we need to grease up the threads of the shell. So, nice bit of grease in there. May as well put a coating on the inside of the non-threaded portion as well, just to help prevent it from corroding. And we're ready to fit a new bottom bracket. So with some anti-seize or grease on the bottom bracket shell, we're ready to fit the new bottom bracket. Always fit it by hand to start with. Then you've got no chance of cross-threading. We then need to tighten it with a tool. Shimano recommend a torque setting between 35 and 50 Newton meters, so that's pretty damn tight. So with the bottom bracket installed, everything lovely and clean, then we can refit the crank. Let's put a grease on the axle, a little bit in there on the thread, and we can guide that in through the drive side. To make sure it's seated properly, just give it a good tap, the plastic mallet, and it's all home and ready to fit the left hand crank. To fit the left hand crank arm, slide it onto the axle. There's only one way it can go on. Push down the tab to secure it, and screw the preload cap into place. I find the best way to preload the bearings is to over tighten this initially, so tighten it pretty damn tight with your fingers, just to make sure it's seated, and back it right off and just gently nip it up with a finger and a thumb. And that should give you the correct preload on your bearings. To secure the crank arm onto the axle, tighten the bolts. If you work from one to the other, tightening them up bit by bit, make sure the tab doesn't pop back up again. Don't tighten one of them all the way, because you'll put a lot of stress on the bolt. Just doing bit by bit. The bolts here to attach the crank onto the axle, one of the places where I would recommend using a torque wrench. Again, tighten them bit by bit. The torque setting for these bolts is between 12 and 14 Newton meters, and that is all sorted. Tabs down, bolts secure, nicely preloaded. Just need to refit our chain device if we removed it, and we're ready to go. So that's it. Bottom bracket's in there, spinning away nicely, chain device is back on, ready to hit the trails again. See you next time. Cheers.